Gardening in Sweden is a rather new field, says Ulf Nordfjell, the Swedish landscape designer who won Best in Show at the Chelsea Flower Show in 2009. It was started with a need to produce vegetables after World War II. You can't compare a Swedish garden with one in Britain or France. That single historical fact quietly explains almost everything a Swedish garden doesn't have. Today, 9 things Swedish gardens almost never have. Stay until number 5 because it's probably the single largest feature in your own backyard right now. Swedish garden culture didn't emerge from centuries of formal estate design the way British or French gardens did. It emerged from post-war necessity, and that origin still shapes what does and doesn't belong in a Swedish yard today. This distinction runs deeper than it first sounds. A garden tradition born from centuries of aristocratic estate design tends to treat beauty and function as genuinely separate questions. An ornamental garden existing specifically because a working kitchen garden already existed somewhere else on the property, tended by staff, out of sight. Sweden never really had that luxury of separation at scale. When the colony allotment movement took hold after the war, a family's entire available garden space needed to do real work, producing food while also being the only outdoor space that family had. Beauty and function were never given the chance to become separate categories in the first place, and that history is still legible in how a Swedish garden gets built today, even in households with no direct memory of post-war scarcity. Let's look at what that history removes. Number 1. Perfectly manicured, geometric topiary hedges shaped into precise artificial forms. Swedish gardens tend to favor a looser, more naturalistic silhouette, plants allowed to grow closer to their own natural shape rather than sculpted into rigid geometry that has to be maintained constantly to hold its form. Number 2. Elaborate ornamental flower beds, chosen purely for color coordination, with no other function. Nordfjell's own description of the Swedish relationship to gardens, more a piece of nature, maybe with some strawberries and roses, captures the difference directly. A Swedish garden tends to blend function and beauty rather than separating them into a purely decorative zone. Number 3. Large, formal water fountains as decorative centerpieces. Ornamental water features built primarily to be looked at, rather than used or connected to any natural water source nearby, tend to be rare in Swedish gardens, where water in a garden is more likely to be a small, naturalistic pond than an engineered fountain. Number 4. Entirely hardscaped yards with minimal planting, more patio and paving than actual garden. Swedish outdoor space tends to prioritize green, growing area even in small urban plots, following a cultural instinct that outdoor space exists primarily to grow something, not simply to provide a hard surface for furniture. Now here's number 5, the one I promised. It's probably the single largest feature in your own backyard right now. Number 5, a large manicured lawn as the garden's main showpiece feature. Here's what's worth sitting with. Sweden's garden history runs directly against this. In Stockholm, a system of allotment gardens called koloni emerged specifically so residents without their own land could grow food. One-room wooden cabins surrounded by small, intensively planted vegetable and flower plots, still popular enough today that people join waiting lists for a chance at one. That post-war instinct, use available land to grow something, never fully gave way to the ornamental lawn culture common elsewhere. A lawn requiring water, mowing, and chemical maintenance simply to look uniform, producing nothing, sits awkwardly against a garden tradition literally born from the need to grow food during genuine scarcity. Where a lawn does exist in a Swedish garden, it tends to be a modest secondary space, not the main event the rest of the yard defers to. The colony gardens are worth sitting with a little longer because they weren't a temporary wartime measure that quietly faded once the emergency passed. They became a genuinely durable part of Swedish urban life, still oversubscribed generations later, with people waiting years for the chance at a small plot most of them will use for exactly the same purpose their grandparents' generation did, growing something real in soil they don't otherwise have access to. A culture that maintains that kind of sustained, multi-generational demand for productive garden space isn't likely to simultaneously develop a strong parallel tradition of unproductive ornamental lawn as a status marker, the way that instinct developed in countries whose garden history ran through country estates rather than post-war allotments. There's a practical dimension worth naming, too. A lawn's entire value proposition rests on being looked at rather than used for much else, walked across occasionally, admired, kept uniform. Compare that to even a small vegetable bed in the same square footage, which produces something tangible across an entire growing season. Once a garden culture has spent decades treating outdoor space as something that should produce a return, however modest, a lawn's specific kind of unproductive maintenance starts to look less like an obvious default and more like a choice that needs its own separate justification. Number 6. Solid privacy fences that completely block any visual connection to the surrounding landscape. Sweden's Allemansrätten, the right of public access enshrined in the Constitution since 1994, shapes a cultural relationship with land that extends even into private gardens, a general comfort with permeable boundaries rather than fully sealed-off private space. Fences exist, but the instinct to wall off a garden completely from the wider landscape runs against a deeper cultural assumption that nature, and to some extent the land itself, isn't meant to be fully privatized in the first place. It's worth being precise about what Allemansrätten actually grants, since the concept is easy to overstate. It doesn't erase private property or grant strangers the right to walk directly through someone's garden. It governs uncultivated land specifically, forests, meadows, the wilder spaces just beyond where a cultivated garden ends. But living inside a legal and cultural framework where the land immediately surrounding a private garden is, by default, open to respectful public passage tends to shape a different relationship with the boundary itself, less an impenetrable wall separating two entirely different categories of space, more a soft transition between a cultivated area and a wider landscape everyone has some legitimate claim to. The 1994 codification itself is worth pausing on, since it clarifies something easy to misunderstand. Allemansrätten wasn't invented by that constitutional language. It formalized a custom already understood well enough that, as one description of it puts it, most Swedes asked about its origins would mumble something about medieval tradition, even though the actual legal text is quite recent and quite brief, essentially one sentence establishing that everyone has access to nature according to this everyman's right. A principle that old, that deeply assumed rather than actively taught, tends to shape everyday choices, like how solid to build a garden fence, without anyone consciously invoking the legal reasoning behind it. Number 7. High-maintenance, non-native exotic plants poorly suited to Sweden's climate. Species requiring constant winter protection, specific soil amendments, or conditions the local climate simply doesn't provide tend to lose out to native and climate-adapted plants, chosen because they survive Swedish winters without extraordinary intervention rather than because they photograph impressively for one warm month a year. This connects to a broader pattern in Swedish landscape design specifically, an emphasis on plants that genuinely belong to the region rather than ones imported for a particular aesthetic trend. Anemone nemorosa, the wood anemone, blooming in Swedish forests each spring, or Linnea borealis, the delicate twin flower discovered and named after the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus, tend to appear in Swedish gardens specifically because they're already adapted to thrive there, not despite the climate, but because of it. Even the Norway spruce, so central to Swedish forest identity that individual specimens have been documented living for over 9,000 years by continually pushing new growth from the same root system after the main trunk dies back, represents this same underlying logic. Resilience shaped directly by the specific conditions of the place, not imposed on top of them through constant intervention. Number 8. Garden furniture arranged primarily for how it looks in photographs, rarely actually used. A perfectly styled outdoor seating area that sits untouched most of the summer contradicts the same practical instinct running through the rest of Swedish garden culture, that outdoor space earns its place through genuine use, not through how convincingly it stages a lifestyle nobody's actually living in it. Furniture chosen and arranged this way tends to prioritize a single, idealized photograph over the actual, repeated experience of sitting there on an ordinary Tuesday evening, which is precisely the kind of mismatch Swedish garden culture, rooted in genuine daily use rather than occasional display, tends to avoid by default. There's a specific image worth holding on to here: the colony cabins mentioned earlier. Small, unpretentious wooden structures surrounded by working plots rather than styled outdoor living rooms. Nobody joins a years-long waiting list for a one-room garden cabin because it photographs beautifully. They join because the space genuinely gets used, weekend after weekend, season after season, for the specific purpose it was built for. That's a useful contrast to hold against furniture arranged mainly for a single striking image, since the colony tradition suggests the opposite standard entirely. A garden space earns real value through repeated, ordinary use, not through how impressively it performs in the one photograph taken of it each summer. Number 9. And this is the one that tends to surprise people most: a complete absence of anything edible or foraged. No berries, no herbs, nothing connecting the garden to the tradition of Allemansrätten foraging that shapes so much of Swedish outdoor culture more broadly. Swedish gardens, following directly from Nordfjell's own description, tend to include at least some strawberries, some herbs, some small edible element, even in an otherwise ornamental space. A small continuation of the post-war vegetable garden, even in gardens that today serve mostly for pleasure rather than necessity. Sweden's forests offer cloudberries and lingonberries, found almost exclusively in Scandinavia, alongside blueberries and raspberries growing wild and free to gather under Allemansrätten, and that culture of foraging tends to bleed naturally into what people choose to grow deliberately at home. A lingonberry bush or a handful of herbs planted less because a garden design guide recommended it, and more because eating something you grew yourself has never really stopped being part of what a garden in Sweden is understood to be for. That's all 9. None of it means Swedish gardens are austere or purely utilitarian. It means the line between beautiful and useful was never drawn as sharply there as it was in garden traditions, with centuries of formal estate history behind them. It's worth naming what actually threads through all 9 of these, because it's easy to hear a list like this and assume the underlying value is simply minimalism, applied to a garden the way it gets applied to a closet or a desk. That's not quite it. The thread here isn't about owning fewer plants or a smaller garden. It's about a specific historical accident, that Swedish garden culture matured during a period when land had to earn its keep, and that expectation never fully dissolved even as gardens shifted from wartime necessity toward genuine pleasure. A garden built primarily to be looked at, whether through topiary, ornamental flower beds, or an immaculate lawn, is answering a question: does this look impressive? That Swedish garden history was never especially organized around answering in the first place. Here's a simple test for your own outdoor space. Look at what's currently there and ask whether each element produces something: food, genuine use, real connection to the land around it, or exists purely as a maintained backdrop. Nordfjell's own comparison is worth returning to directly. You can't compare a Swedish garden to a British or French one, and that's not a limitation. It's a genuinely different set of values about what a garden is actually for. This test resists an easy universal answer, and that's deliberate. A garden built purely for aesthetic pleasure isn't automatically wrong, and plenty of gardens throughout history, Swedish ones included, have leaned into beauty specifically as the point. The test isn't asking whether beauty is allowed. It's asking whether every element in a given space was chosen honestly for what it actually does, or simply because it's what a garden is generally supposed to look like, a distinction that applies just as much to a Swedish yard quietly accumulating ornamental features nobody uses as it does to a lawn maintained mainly out of habit rather than genuine enjoyment. A garden that genuinely works was never built by maximizing how it photographs. It was built the way Swedish gardens tend to be built, around function first, growing something first, beauty following naturally rather than being imposed from outside. Even Nordfjell's own award-winning design work, formal enough to win at Chelsea, still carries that same underlying instinct that a garden should feel like an extension of the natural landscape around it rather than a deliberate departure from it. It's worth adding one final note on what this list isn't, since it would be easy to hear all of this as an argument against ever choosing a plant, a fence, or a piece of furniture for how it looks. That was never the point. Swedish gardens are still genuinely beautiful, often strikingly so, precisely because beauty and function were never treated as competing goals there. A native wildflower bed can be extraordinary to look at while also supporting local pollinators. A small vegetable patch can be arranged thoughtfully enough to feel intentional rather than merely practical. The goal was never austerity for its own sake. It was refusing to let appearance be the only question a garden has to answer. Tell me in the comments which of these 9 describes your own backyard right now. Which number is in your own backyard? Meet us in the comments and tell us. I'll see you in the next one.